Alright, final lecture, part 2, Modernism and Postmodernism in Europe and America from 1945 to 1980. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about contemporary art in a lecture, but I encourage you to look at the Art 21 link that I've included in external links, and also the PS1 MoMA Museum's website is an excellent resource for discovering new artists. But I'll go back to the lecture. I'm going to start with a little refresher. I mentioned World War I and II in the previous lecture, and we're going to just mention World War II again because it was the deadliest war in history, and it did see the use of the atomic bomb, and not only did many people die, but many cities were destroyed, especially in Europe, like Paris, Berlin, and Dresden, which were former centers of the art world in the Western world. And as a result of this, a lot of artists and art production moved instead to America, to New York City, which is a trend that we still see reflected today. So a lot of artists will move to New York looking for opportunities. There are a lot of major galleries there, and also a lot of major museums. Most of the artwork that we're going to be looking at, or the artists we're looking at, I should say, not necessarily the artwork, are represented by MoMA. MoMA also has a pretty good website, which some of you have been utilizing. And let's review these two words first. Abstraction versus representation. So what do these words mean in an art context? In an art context, abstraction refers to whether or not an artwork is representational, which means whether or not the art looks, which is to say represents, something that we can recognize. An artwork that depicts a fictional subject is not abstract, so a painting of a unicorn isn't an abstract painting necessarily, so long as the subject of the art is recognized as a thing. So down below we've got some images here. Are they abstract or representational? Moving from left to right, we can say this Pollock on the far left is abstract. What about the Ladies of Avignon by Picasso? Are they abstract or representational? It is an abstraction of reality, but it is a representation of women. And so is Dali's Persistence of Memory, and certainly Kaufman, Cornelia representing her children as her treasures, is very much a representational painting. So we see on the left this full range of abstraction, pure abstraction, moving into pure representation. Abstract Expressionism was a style that appeared around 1950, and it was the first major avant-garde art style that was developed in the United States, and specifically in New York City. The abstract expressionists used many different techniques, but they all made abstract works. These artists were influenced by the Surrealists, and they tried to tap into the unconscious in the act of making their work, so not necessarily in the subjects that they displayed in their work. And the two most famous abstract expressionist painters are Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko, both of them Americans. Here is an image of Pollock painting, and this YouTube link will go to a video of him painting. If you just look up Pollock painting on YouTube, you'll see what I mean. You can see that he's got a can of paint there, and he is in the act of flinging it onto the canvas very directly, which was a very active way of making the painting. And the idea here is that in this kind of active, thoughtless mode of just flinging the medium, the paint, directly onto the canvas, one might be able to tap into the unconscious mind and unleash things that would otherwise not be seen if somebody was trying to paint in a way that they had been quote-unquote trained to paint. In Lavender Mist, we can see that that act of very athletic flinging of the paint has covered the entire composition. This is pure abstraction, but the image itself could remind one of many things. So Lavender Mist is a title that evokes the natural world, but one could say that within it you might also see barbed wire and the fences of a camp of, you know, Holocaust survivors, or the ashes and smoke of the horror of Dresden, or a peaceful morning by a lake. Whatever it is, you are placing yourself within it and tapping into your own unconscious to read this painting that was created through a method that was meant to evoke the unconscious. It's the artist's act of making as well as the artist's idea that are as important to the piece as your own ideas which you bring to looking at a work like this. I'm including this completely random tourist photo that I found on the internet of this actual painting so that you can get a sense of scale. When you look at the work, it's huge, so that you are allowed to be engulfed by it when you're standing in front of it alone, actually looking at the painting, not looking at the person taking a picture of you. I encourage you to watch the movie about Pollock and his wife Lee Krasner, who is a fantastic painter in her own right, are both fascinating figures. Mona Lisa Smiles, sort of crappy, sorry if you liked it, movie that also talks about Pollock. So you'll see a lot of this artwork that we're going to be looking at in this lecture is referenced in pop culture, popular culture. All right, let's talk a little bit about modernist formalism. First off, what does that name mean? Formalism means emphasizing the form or technique used to make the artwork and de-emphasizing the concept or idea of the piece. Modernist formalism emphasizes the color, the art materials, and visual effects, and artists that are working in this mode believe that the physical aspect of the artwork carries the concept and the importance of the artwork itself. This is Ellsworth Kelly, and its title is Red, Blue, and Green, so that you don't get too lost in the title, because that's exactly what it is. It's red, blue, and green. And the colors and the relationships between the shapes create a certain amount of visual tension that this artist argues is when the viewer allows themselves to get lost in the formal aspects of the piece, as engaging, if not perhaps more engaging, because it's also freeing, than a representational image, as this is entirely abstract. Here are some images of Ellsworth Kelly's other works in a gallery, so you get a sense of what it would be like to interact with these pieces in the actual space. Here is a work by Bridget Riley, and these are all American artists, by the way, and it's tempera on composition board. So these are fairly recognizable materials. You've probably painted with a version of tempera, sort of a student version, in school, because it's a non-toxic paint, and composition board is kind of like matte board. But what's incredible about this is that she hand painted this image to create this fascinating visual effect, so that even though it's such a simple use of material, you can find yourself entirely lost in this image, and indeed almost pulled into it because of the visual effects. She was interested in the formal aspects of the materials and twisting them slightly, working with them, so that in itself would be the standing point of the artwork. There's a picture of her with some of her work. Pop art. When you hear the term pop art, think about the word popular. That's where it takes its name from. So this is pop as in popular culture. Pop artists took images, and indeed take images, because there are lots of artists who are still working in this vein, that are familiar to American consumerist society, and then they turn these images into subjects for their art. Pop art reached its height, arguably, in the 1960s in New York, especially because of the production of Andy Warhol, who is the most famous pop artist. Here is a work by Jasper Johns. This here is very obviously pop art. Why? Because it takes as its subject the American flag. and I just Googled American flag, and those are two images on the left that came up, you'll see that the American flag is still being cycled and recycled endlessly through the minds of American popular culture inventors. But here, Jasper Johns has chosen to represent it as a subject of this piece, which is encaustic. That's a form of painting with pigment that has been suspended in wax, hot wax, and melted onto these canvases that have been layered one on top of the other so that it looks like the flag is coming out at you forever and ever and ever, which, thanks to American popular culture, it kind of is. But what artists that were working as pop artists were trying to do was take the things that we see in everyday life, but then treat them with an extra amount of attention and care, and then show them in the context of art so that we would be forced to reevaluate things that we took for granted. Here, for example, a work by Roy Lichtenstein, who would take images from comics that you find in the newspaper, and on the left we have an example of the original comic with one of Roy Lichtenstein's paintings of the comic derived from the comic on the right. So you can see that he's very clearly referencing the images. They're not exactly the same. Most of these images are pretty big. This one here is almost 4 by 4 feet, and they were hand painted to imitate the style of printing, that very cheap style where there's a half tone, which is a fine dot pattern in order to create different shades and colors. And this is a woman that is experiencing extreme heartbreak. She is in a puddle of her own tears, and if she stays this way, she'll drown. But really, with pop art, everything is flattened. So even this moment of extreme despair is just simplified down into its most basic elements. And in the form of true kitsch, it mirrors our own emotional despair, but then heightens it to such an extent that it becomes absurd and indeed almost meaningless. Andy Warhol, the most famous pop artist. Here are some quotes. I'll let you read them while I talk a little bit about Warhol himself. He was from Pittsburgh, moved to New York, was very socially awkward. It could be argued that he used his art as a way to try and connect to the world, but also hide behind an image that he created of himself. He was known for always wearing a wig and usually carrying a tape recorder to record what other people were saying. And he created not only visual artworks, but also movies and even a novel. And he had what was called a factory in New York where he hired people to create his artwork for him. This is a very commonplace way for artists to work nowadays. So I think a lot of people have this image of an artist working in isolation, creating one piece after another completely alone in their studio. That's entirely untrue. Most artists who make a living nowadays will have a whole slew of people working for them in a factory-like setting, which, if you think about it, isn't that uncommon from artists in the Renaissance who would often have whole crews of people working with and for them. I'm starting to get derailed, so let's go back to this piece here, Green Coca-Cola Bottles by Andy Warhol. This is oil on canvas, although a lot of Warhol's images were actually screen printed, which is the same process that's used to make t-shirts, among other things. Warhol loved the subject of the Coca-Cola bottle because he said that Coke was something that couldn't be improved and was enjoyed by the poor man just as much as it was enjoyed by people that were of the highest class of American culture. But everyone was enjoying the exact same taste. And that's what Warhol's work is about, taking something that we all understand, that we've all lived with, and then turning it into art so that we can see it from a distance, which art provides, and appreciate the beauty of it. Superrealism, which is sometimes referred to as hyperrealism, is artwork that makes the real image look even more real than real. What does that mean? It means that when we see with our eyes, we only focus on one thing at a time, so we actually never see something in full focus. Super realistic art features everything in a very high, sharp focus at the same time. Chuck Close is an artist that's famed for working in this style. You've probably seen his work before. It's almost always of very large portraits. This is his first work that received any serious sort of critical acclaim. It is what it says, a big self-portrait, acrylic on canvas, and you can see that it's 8 and 11, which is basically 9 feet by 7 feet. Chuck Close, just interesting side note, has a disability where he isn't able to recognize people by their faces, only their voices, which is why he has a lifelong fascination with portraying faces. Okay, Dwayne Hanson, a sculptor known for making sculptures like this of regular, ordinary people, but making them hyper-realistic. So if you walk into a gallery, some of his other sculptures will be of policemen or gallery attendants, and they'll look so real that you'll actually think that they're a real person until you look a little closer and realize that they've just been minutely detailed and very carefully made to look as though they were real, but taking images, not images in this case, but actual people that we're familiar with in our everyday lives, but elevating them to the ideal of art. Conceptual art. We talked a little bit about conceptual art in the last lecture. A concept is just a thought. So conceptual art is art that takes the idea, the thought, and makes that the most important aspect of the work. So this is an avant-garde, one could say, mode of art practice that became popularized in the 60s, and it's still prevalent today. Conceptual art is art where the material is the concept or concepts. So in other words, painters use paint, sculptors make sculptures, and conceptual artists develop ideas. They develop concepts. Conceptual art often can't be bought or sold. It is often non-material, and therefore, by value of being non-material, it's anti-capitalist. I included down here the work of Joseph Beuys. We're about to talk about Yoko Ono. I know she's received a lot of hate, but a lot of her conceptual art is actually pretty cool. And on the far right, a piece by Eva Hess, who I don't think we're going to have time to talk about. I include this slide about performance art right after this because performance art and new media often dovetail into or with conceptual art. Performance art is art that takes the form of a live presentation, usually by the artist, but not always. Performance art pieces are often documented with photographs, film, stills, and or videos. New media is just a term that refers to modern technology being used to make artwork. This could include the internet, television, any sort of video, neon lights even. Even photography can be included in this. By contrast, old media would be anything pre-modern, so oil paint, marble, carving, etching, etc. All of these concepts, so conceptual art, performance art, and new media can exist independently of each other, or they can be combined together in any sort of arrangement. Here is a work by Bruce Nauman using new media, and it says, which is also the title, "The true artist helps the world by revealing mystic truths." That statement is a very succinct way of summing up a lot of conceptual art. So the role of the artist in contemporary society isn't to carve a portrait out of marble. That's already been done a bajillion times. What Bruce Nauman is trying to say is that perhaps in this world, the true role of the artist is to think about things in a different way and present that thought to the public in a way that they can understand. So Nauman is using art media, in this case neon lights, which is something we understand as part of our popular culture, but then using that in a gallery context to try and lure in the modern viewer and jolt them into a thought that might be different from what they actually believe. This YouTube link will take you to the actual video of Meet Joy by Schneemann, and Schneemann was an early feminist artist. Meet Joy is very much what this still of the video and the title itself suggests. It's a bunch of people dancing around with meat. And, well, what do you feel about that? Most people really hated it when it was unveiled. And it's critical of human relations, of the meat market that is the art world, that has been the art world for centuries. This isn't exactly a dance. This isn't exactly a music video. It's not. It's obviously not. Thanks, computer. It's not a painting or a drawing. And it wasn't very well received, but a lot of artists were very inspired by this artwork, and we'll see today a lot of artists working in this vein. Then finally, let's look at some work by Joseph Beuys. Beuys is a performance and conceptual artist. His most famous saying is, "Everyone is an artist," which is something he truly believed through example. And through all of his artwork, that was something that he always sought to express. He claims to have been in an airplane that was shot down in World War II, somewhere over Siberia, and had a long tale that he would tell of having to walk across Siberia and being initiated by the shaman, the medicine men of the region, into universal truths, which he then, after the war, tried to bring to the public through his art. Whether or not that's actually a true story is up for debate, but that is the way that he created art. And his work is a mixture of new media, of conceptual art, and of performance. New media here is some fat that has been put onto a chair, and the fat is seeping down into the chair. So not only is this a different way of using materials, but it's actually not even a stable piece of artwork. It's changing constantly because fat melts. Here, this is evidence of a performance, so this is a lecture that Joseph Beuys gave, and then as a result of this performative lecture, you have the chalkboard here and his drawings, and that's the only evidence, and that and the change that he effected on the people who were listening to him is the only evidence of that art piece. Here is in the center is a picture of a deer with antlers growing out of his head, because he said that animals with antlers were able to externalize their internal body, which is what artists should try and do as well. And in this piece here, "I Like America and America Likes Me" is the title. He locked himself in a room with a cane, a top hat, and a blanket, and a wild coyote, and videoed their interactions as a metaphor for the colonization of America. In this performance, called "How to Explain Pictures to a Dead Hare," Joseph Beuys covered his face with honey and gold and carried this dead hare, which is a large type of rabbit, around a gallery and tried to explain artwork to him, which is of course absurd, but you can see how a performance like this is critical of art as well. And the act of covering his face in gold is a reference to shamanism and to witchcraft, which it could be claimed art is, because the artist tries to take materials that in themselves may be worthless or meaningless and then turn them into something else by extending their own effort, concepts, and time into manipulating the work or manipulating the raw material, and then explaining it to a perhaps unresponsive public, which could be symbolized by the dead hare. But what exactly does this mean? That is left to the viewer to do the work of trying to interpret. And that is the end of this lecture. Thank you.